Good evening, everyone. I'm very glad to be here today, and as I know, the series of lectures which take place, I think, every Wednesday for about a month, it is held by some very notable speakers. I'm very honored to be in such company. I'm quite surprised every year when the colleagues invite me, but nevertheless, I'm very happy to share whatever I know. So the topic today is changes in energy markets that we have experienced throughout the year 2019 and at the beginning of 2020, and how they impact Russia. But I have to confess right away that since I know natural gas markets and I specialize in natural gas markets, that the focus of today's lecture, except for a general overview, will be focused on natural gas. But the market for natural gas, I think it can be taken as an example, and if you're a student, you can take this path in analyzing the impacts of developments in other fuel markets on the Russian economy, if you do it as your own research project. Let us start. The first page, I would like to just give a general overview what were the key topics throughout 2019. If we're talking about oil markets, obviously, this is Russia's position in the OPEC Plus deal, and keeping up with OPEC members. I think Russia, together with Saudi Arabia, is one of the core decision makers in this process, in those regular meetings which take place in Vienna, and determine the future collaboration between oil producers in order to keep the level of oil prices at a reasonable level for those countries. So as we see throughout 2019, even though Russia agreed to introduce new cuts and started them as of January 2019, nevertheless, Russia managed to remain on a slightly upward trend in terms of both oil production as well as oil exports. And actually, oil exports to non-former Soviet Union countries have increased, judging from the preliminary data from 2019. The benchmark for reductions, which was taken as of October 2018, the daily production, it was fairly high, so this meant that the targets still allowed a stable level of oil production. And I mean, oil is the central fuel, and it provides for the largest share of money that flows into the Russian budget. So therefore, we start with this fuel. The second important fuel, but the most interesting for me personally, is natural gas. So from 2019, what we see is that, first, that I think I didn't show it on this slide, but I will talk about this in more detail further throughout the lecture, is generally speaking, we saw a picture of oversupply in the market because there was a lot of additional production, which managed to reach market through LNG, and this oversupply led to a drop in prices. But despite this, Russia managed, and Russian companies managed to maintain their role in key markets, particularly if we're talking about pipeline exports, our core market, and the central one until December 2019, it was the European direction. So in this direction, the pipeline exports have decreased only by a small figure. If we're talking about LNG, then definitely what we saw is the appearance of Russia as a prominent, noticeable player in LNG markets, because Yamal LNG project run by Novatek started to appear very actively in primarily the European market, but also some volumes went to Asia. And based on that, we can conclude that the natural gas sector of Russia also remains competitive today and allows Russian companies to still take a very important role in international natural gas trade. If we're talking about coal, then this is the third fossil fuel, and I mean, when we're talking about energy markets, we generally would think of oil, natural gas, coal as the traditional basis for energy systems across the world with different variations, but all of these three fossil fuels play an important role and take roughly 3/4 of global energy demand. And coal is definitely not least important out of that. Depending on the regional market, we look at the importance of this fuel. So here on the right-hand side, I provide a little graph with orange figure. I will share the slide so you'll be able to see it better. So with orange color, I demonstrate the share of Russia in global structure of exports. And Russia is not the largest exporter of coal in the world, but nevertheless, it definitely takes up an important role. So in the past years, the Russian coal exports were on an increase trend. And what we see today globally is a very negative attitude and a very negative polemics against coal because it is the dirtiest out of fossil fuels. And when you burn it and receive the same amount of energy from coal, you receive the largest amount of emissions. Despite that, coal consumption globally has not really been declining, but we'll see when the definitive statistics from 2019 is published. And one of the sources that I would recommend, which is the open source, is BP Statistical Review of World Energy, which is published annually in June. So when definitive data is published from 2019, we'll see whether there has been a decline. But there is a very strong division between the countries in the world who count on various fuels. And while European countries, some of the EU members have announced policies of coal phase out, meaning that they will take steps to eliminate coal from their power generation sector. While some of these European countries have this very strong targets in coal elimination. At the same time, in other parts of the world, coal really remains the core fuel because it is a lot more easily transportable. It is found in a lot more places throughout the world. So as a local fuel, coal is much easier to obtain. And for some countries with smaller, with more modest economic parameters, coal is definitely a solution when we're talking about energy poverty and energy access. So, I mean, there are varying trends in the world, and it is to be seen what a place will be reserved for coal. But Russia has a very ambitious policy in the coal market, so we see an improvement of the share in global exports and so forth. So probably clean coal technologies, the technologies of using coal and producing electricity from it and using it in other installations would coincide with methods of carbon capture and storage and so on to make it more ecologically friendly. And in China, for example, clean coal approach seems to be gaining its ground because a couple of years ago, when it was simply prohibited in some regions to run coal-fired power plants, there were natural gas shortages because natural gas is the first and the easiest substitution for coal in power generation. So natural gas shortages led to the fact that instead of trying to get additional volumes of LNG from the outside, from external markets, maybe it's easier to do something with emissions management. And the fourth important parameter for 2019 is climate change related policies. So what we see is an increasing global pressure on both hydrocarbon industries, on the companies who produce hydrocarbons. There is a very strong pressure, for example, in terms of investment. So when investors now want to come to the energy sector and invest money, they want the company to report what is their action in terms of limiting the carbon footprint, the carbon intensity of their products. So even though they still would like to come to the energy sector and make money on that, they want it to look efficient. And in this context, I have to mention that Russia has actually, in fact, ratified the Paris Climate Agreement. It went kind of very, I would say, unnoticed through the media, because it was not the regular notification, but it was the president's decree to go around the regular procedure to ratify this agreement. So this happened in September, so Russia is now part of this process. And I think the one task is to start speaking this common language. I would say that in energy lingua franca today is the what is your climate impact. This is how it seems to me. But hydrocarbons are not going anywhere overnight. So these are, I would say, two very important messages that I would like to transmit today, is that while climate is important and it depends on actions of every one of us, what happens to the ecological situation around, but it is not possible to sustainably continue our lives without the core three hydrocarbons, which Russia plays an important role in. And obviously the presence in these markets provides for a very large part in Russia's budget, in Russia's existence overall in like large-scale macroeconomic terms. So let us then focus on natural gas markets and look into some details of what has been going on. So in the natural gas markets, we see that climate-related policies were on the rise in various parts of the world. There has been a strong addition in liquefaction capacity. Natural gas can be transported in two modes, via the pipeline or in the form of liquefied natural gas. So if a pipeline, I think everyone is more or less aware of how it works, and St. Petersburg is a very good city where you have gas supply to pretty much every household for cooking, and you have a little pipeline in your flat back home which brings natural gas to the stove. And another way of transportation of natural gas on a large scale is cooling it down to a significantly low temperature, to minus 160 to 63 degrees. This is the boiling point for methane, which is the main element of natural gas. And at this temperature, at regular pressure, it becomes liquid. And it takes 600 times less space, and basically becomes possible to put it in a tanker and transport by sea. Liquefied natural gas, or LNG, can be transported in trucks, in cryogenic, various types of cryogenic carriers. And generally there is an understanding that for short distances you would rather use a pipeline to supply natural gas, but the longer the distance is, the more economical it becomes to transport natural gas in the liquefied form. The reason is the cost of liquefaction process. So basically you have to spend a lot of energy, spend a lot of money by using this energy to put it in, to cool it down to minus 163 degrees, and also to keep this temperature. So basically, instead of a regular truck, while transporting, you would have like a refrigerator or a floating refrigerator, broadly speaking, when you do a maritime transportation. So what happened in 2019, and this process, I mean, it smoothly kind of evolved throughout some past years now, is that more and more countries, more and more companies decided to get into LNG business. So the availability of this product in the liquefied form created a situation of oversupply in the market. All of a sudden, there was more natural gas available than ever before, while demand growth was not as steep as the supply growth. Just one note is that still, even though there was, and I will show some graphs later on what exactly was the increase in capacity, even though LNG today is a very hot topic, still a major part of natural gas, the major share of natural gas, is transported via pipeline, via trunk, large diameter pipelines. So in terms of percentages, about 89–90% of cross-border deliveries of natural gas are taking place through the pipeline, while only about 11% of cross-border deliveries engage LNG tankers. So even though it's a hot topic, it's still not yet like the backbone of the natural gas market as such. The third point is there has been a further trend toward the commoditization of the market. And if some 5–7 years ago we had only one properly liquid market, which is the United States of America, and in the European region, it was just in 2011 the third energy package, the regulation package, determining how the market works. It introduced natural gas hubs all over the European Union, and the hubs, they only kind of were at the beginning phase of their development. Now European hubs are already liquid enough to provide benchmarks for various transactions within the long-term contracts as well. In Asia, the Asian market was lagging behind, but more and more often now at various events and conferences you hear that the prominence of a regional index, the Japan Career Marker, JKM, is becoming more important, and its derivatives are being traded on a larger scale. And basically this commoditization of the natural gas markets, it was very widely spoken of when I was myself a student 10 years ago, when I was doing master's degree and I studied the geopolitics of energy markets. Our teachers told us about this future, possibly when natural gas markets become something similar to oil, when you can very easily get a delivery and you know the price, and the price, even though it's volatile, but you know that you look at the price reporting agency for this price. We spoke of that as future, and I think the future is now that it is being helped by this market conditions, the oversupplied market that we see today. And the fourth point that I wanted to speak of, and I think all of you also read the news about the coronavirus. I see some people in masks today. I forgot to wear mine. But anyways, the Chinese market, actually, this country is the center of the epidemic. And basically, the fact that people in some places, in some cities in China, like in Wuhan, they have to stay at home, they don't go to work. Basically, this affects economic activity. And energy demand is a direct function of economic activity. So there are two basic things that affect energy demand, is the amount of population and their work, so their economic activities. So when we determine the future of energy demand, we look at the future population growth, the forecast of population growth, and we look at forecast of GDP, how they're going to work. And basically what happens in China today is that industrial activity was to a large extent put on hold. So this affects economic situation, this affects energy demand in the country, and because China has gained importance in global markets and particularly in natural gas market, this obviously affects global markets. And actually the situation with this epidemic shows exactly how much China is affecting energy markets, because based on the dynamics of China's GDP and China's demand for oil, for natural gas, the analytical agencies are reviewing their forecasts for the year 2020. And if we're talking about oil demand, for example, this might turn into the first year since 2009 when we're actually going to experience a decline in oil demand. And 2009 was the year of crisis, the economic crisis, which led to contraction in economic activity and led to contraction in energy demand and oil demand in particular. So this is quite a big influence that China has on the market. Now let's look at some of these issues in more detail. So for climate-related policies, I did not make the full list of policies because I think that this is not exactly the topic of my today's presentation, but I used the World Energy Council methodology and visual. It's not very visible. I apologize. I did not foresee that it wouldn't show. I think this is more visible. So basically, there are a vertical axis and a horizontal axis in this graph. It's not that is not visible. The horizontal axis demonstrates the impact of a certain factor on overall energy system, economic system, and the vertical axis shows to what extent this factor is uncertain, and there are various factors that World Energy Council put on this scale, depending on the answers of, I think, the question about 2,000 people from the political spheres, from companies, so the high-level like decision makers and CEOs of various companies to evaluate various factors. And so if we go here, then in this area of the chart, the factors would be very important and taking the minds of decision makers, not letting them sleep at night. And these factors, the blue ones, which have high impact but more certain, keep them busy during the day. And if you look at these factors, then we can notice that a lot of them have to do with climate-related policies. So I remember, I cannot read this, but I remember from reading the World Energy Council report, the link to which I also will include in the slides when we publish them on the EUSP website, is that it really has to do with renewables and energy efficiency, keeping decision makers busy, and particularly the batteries, electric storage is something that keeps them awake at night. So this is something for the future. There are more traditional issues that we're used to, like the market design and security of supply of fuels. But nevertheless, I found it very interesting how many of the issues were pointed out as having very large impact that are present in climate-related policies. So I would not torture you with the previous slide, but I will continue the torture with more graphs, which I think I will pay more attention to making them more visible next time. But nevertheless, from climate-related policies, we see that the traditional businesses will be under severe pressure in terms of like finding the place in the new systems. And what we're also going to see is the change in, so when we're talking about geopolitics of energy today, we would still very strongly think about fossil fuels. When we talk about geopolitics of energy tomorrow, we will also speak of the supplies for batteries, like rare earth metals, lithium, and other materials that you need for production of those new assets that will make the new electrified systems running. So the factors that have led to oversupply in natural gas markets in 2019 and beginning of 2020 include the additions in liquefaction capacity, which are demonstrated here in the top slide with blue columns. And we see that it definitely has been on the rise in the past years. The winter this year was warm, and as you know, if it's not your first winter in St. Petersburg, you know that this is, even though St. Petersburg is the most European out of Russian cities, this winter, which looks much like winter in European city, still is not normal for St. Petersburg. We're used to more snow, and yeah, so this is something that all of you have noticed. The storage, underground storages were full, and the inventories were very high, particularly in Europe, which also meant that even though the expectations were for more or less normal winter and gas companies in Europe decided to acquire natural gas and put it in the underground storage for the use in winter. This did not materialize, so they remained at a very high level throughout the winter months. And also there was a high rate of final investment decisions on liquefaction capacity. This is a very interesting and important factor demonstrated here in the orange columns. So the vertical axis is providing us the orientation of the volume of natural gas that will be available. So each of the project is added up, and what we see is the final figures. So the capacity additions would be about 40-50 billion cubic meters if we convert it to gaseous conditions, if we're talking about the LNG market. And for final investment decisions, these are the projects that the companies running these projects, they come together with investors, with all of the parties involved, and they say definitively that now the project will go ahead. And generally, we can judge from the trends in final investment decisions what would be the capacity additions in several years. And if we compare these two graphs, then we see that this peak in final investment decisions around the year 2005 led to a wave of additions in capacity several years later. Then we see some kind of wave here in 2011, 12, 13, and 14. This is the time when energy prices were at high levels, so for the companies engaged in this business and for investors, this was a good sign that they can make money in the future if they make the decision now. So this wave, what we see is now coming on stream. And what is interesting to see, this is 2019. These are all of the projects that have made final investment decisions on LNG last year. So in the future, in the next several years, we are going to see these new projects which have taken FID, adding to this situation. So what it led, all of these factors that I have listed on the left-hand side, led to the price dynamics. We have three lines here on the right graph. The green line is natural gas prices in North America. Namely, this price is called Henry Hub. This is not the only hub in North America, but the central one. And dark green line shows average monthly price for this at this hub, and lighter green, it's horizontal. This is the average price for 2018 and average price for 2019. It has decreased, not very dramatically. If we look at other regions, the orange is demonstrating European price dynamics, and the price tag that I used for this comparison is TTF, Tidal Transfer Facility. This is a gas hub in the Netherlands, the most liquid hub today in the European market. Has experienced quite some volatility throughout 2018 and dropped to low level and continues the downward movement as of now. And if you look very carefully, then you see the horizontal line. This is average annual price for 2018. This is for 2019, and it is yet to be seen what will be in 2020. And the black line is the Asian price. The price index that I used for this graph is JKM, Japan Korea Marker. And it generally has been going... so in 2018, we already see that it moves in a similar direction as the European price. Although it typically stayed above the European prices. So the gap between the orange line and the black line is size of this gap. So between this orange and the black line is the difference is the signal for the supplier, which market is more profitable. So if this difference is greater than your transportation cost or the difference in transportation cost to Europe and Asia, then obviously you choose the Asian market. And usually Asian market used to be the premium market and provided the orientation for a lot of suppliers, not only LNG, but pipeline suppliers. One of the examples is Gazprom, who had a long story, and in 2014 the company signed a contract, and in 2019 in December launched a pipeline to China, which is part of the Asian market and imports a lot of LNG. But what we see is that in 2018 average price was relatively high, just below $10 per million British thermal units, and the drop has been very dramatic in 2019, and now this difference, the spread between Asian price and European price, at some points it actually turns negative. So Europe sometimes, even with a very low price, it can actually be treated as a premium market versus the Asian market. So it's very interesting dynamic. The prices are on a downward trend, and this creates quite some problems for this new projects that have started up and that are planning to start up, because there is one parameter to look at is the break-even price. Break-even price, I think most of you here are economists who know that break-even price is the orientational, the price in the market in which this project would start to generate profits. So a lot of projects, particularly in the United States of America, LNG export projects, at these prices, I think they're falling below break-even. The only thing is that the contracts that they have signed, the LNG plant operators, are such that these losses are not taken by LNG operators and by the producers in the United States, but rather by the off-takers, by those parties who buy this LNG, who have signed long-term contracts on LNG off-takes. Now let's go further. I really like this graph. We cannot see a lot of details in it, but this one is devoted to the commoditization of the market, and I particularly compared here the prices in the Asian Pacific region, particularly Northeast Asia, joining or like average delivery costs to Japan, South Korea, and China. Japan and South Korea are traditional large buyers of liquefied natural gas, and China is coming strongly into the market. And China potentially could also play this role of bringing together the pipeline supplies and LNG supplies, so the competition between the two modes of transportation, if any, would be determined by dynamics in the Chinese market. So here with the black line, I drew the Henry Hub, the American price, plus the cost of liquefaction and transportation to the Asia-Pacific region. So Henry Hub itself is at a lower level, but the difference is the liquefaction cost and the transportation cost, because comparing it to prices in North America would not make any sense. So if we're talking about Asia-Pacific, we have to take into consideration all of the additional costs. The orange line demonstrates the spot price, Japan-Korea marker, or Northeast Asia spot, how this price behaves if you would like to buy a cargo with a delivery within a couple of weeks. So how much would you pay? And the blue line demonstrates the price of liquefied natural gas if it is linked to the oil price. And what we see is that there are several definitive stages in the development of this market where we see that these prices correlate with each other. So if we're talking about the first stage in this market, it's the oil indexed price on the rise, spot price on the rise, and at some point both of them overtake Henry Hub related prices. At this time, no LNG from the United States of America is going to the Asian region, so this is only a theoretical exercise at this point. Then on the second stage, we see rather stable, it's volatile, but at a high level. The prices are driven by the dynamics in the oil market, and we see that they exceed the benchmark given by Henry Hub if we deliver this gas to the Asia-Pacific region. During this period, a lot of long-term contracts for deliveries of American gas to Asia were taking place, which led to today's losses of off-takers. So in 2013, some Korean companies went and signed a tolling agreement, so they they agreed to pay in any case for the cost of liquefaction, and they have to off-take this gas, and they thought that they would win the difference between their costs of buying natural gas in the American market and what they get in the end market. So they would win. But in fact, when the delivery started, so this is already 2019, When the deliveries started, they started to lose because Henry Hub related price would be higher than the spot price. And because the spot price decoupled from oil indexed price and it provided the lowest possible orientation, it really became a very attractive way of pricing natural gas for Asian buyers. And what we see from plots is that the amount of their derivatives signed for JKM has been very significantly on the rise. And this demonstrates that these indices, they become more and more popular with buyers, and not only for the physical transactions, but also as a financial instrument in their portfolio. So for natural gas, I think what we are seeing now is the commoditization of the market, and the oversupply is definitely helping this trend, because now the buyers could choose a more preferable mode of pricing their deliveries in the contracts, and what it turns into is still to be seen. Some parts of the graphs are missing, but I think we can make it understood. So this slide is meant to demonstrate the importance of China to overall trends in natural gas markets today. So this graph on the left-hand side, you have to use your imagination. It's very easy because this is 100%. So what you don't see is the rest of the world importing LNG. So the little blue blocks in the bottom is imports of LNG by China in 2015 and 2019 respectively. And the remaining part that you have to imagine is the share of the rest of the world in LNG imports. What we see is that China has stepped up its share in global LNG market, and is further going to become more noticeable in pipeline trains trade as supplies through the Power Siberia, the new pipeline which was launched in 2019, as it will ramp up and reach the full capacity. And the second slide also engages some of your imagination. Luckily, it's also percentages. So this is the share of China in incremental LNG demand growth. If we compare 2019 and 2015, global LNG trade has been growing in this time, and 40% of this growth was the responsibility of China, and this is the rest of the world who have been in this game. And generally speaking, the supply structure tells us about which suppliers would be hit mostly by any changes in Chinese demand trends. And the number one country to be hit is Australia. Australia is also characterized by very high costs. And number two, potentially Qatar, but Qatar is much more competitive in terms of costs. So if we're talking about precisely the coronavirus impact, then we can conclude that generally the forecast for demand from China will be revised downwards, and this potentially will hit very strongly the key suppliers and the least competitive of them. And so today, Russia is only a minor supplier to the Chinese market within this green area, which is other suppliers, but with the pipeline supplies increase and with a strong place of China in Gazprom's strategy, potentially this could become an additional point of risk. And I'm realizing that I haven't been speaking about Russia as such that much, but my key conclusions would still be what should be the takeaways from this. And for 2019, in the oil market, Russia maintains a strong position both in terms of the presence in the market, in terms of volumes, although the earnings have somewhat declined due to the price dynamics, but nevertheless, Russia remains a very important player in the OPEC Plus deal. For the coal market, strong position will be kept by the country, but a challenging environment is ahead due to the pressure that is put by climate-related policies on the coal sector in various parts of the world, including the key target areas for target markets for Russia's exports. For natural gas, we can conclude that Russian supplies remain competitive in both economic and environmental terms. So if we're talking about the European market, I think there is generally an understanding that natural gas is a good addition to all of the climate-friendly initiatives. So instead of bashing all of the fossil fuels, probably it should be a reasonable solution to use natural gas to help. And if we compare the pipeline supplies to the European market from Russia, they are competitive in terms of costs, because the fields are conventional and the pipelines that are already in place do not need substantial additional investments. So there were also the diversification of transportation routes that we saw in the past year, particularly the Turk Stream, a new pipeline through the Black Sea, was launched at the beginning of this year, and the Nord Stream 2 will reach its finalization pretty soon. But also from environmental point of view, if you do not have to liquefy the gas, then you do not have to spend this additional energy and you emit less in the process of transportation. But the worrying sign is that there is definitely an oversupplied market with low prices today. There was a hope for the rebalancing of the natural gas market in 2020, but the Chinese situation really leads toward the postponing of rebalancing. And as we saw from the final investment decisions in LNG, then additional volumes will continue to come on stream and the oversupply of natural gas will persist. What will be the exact impact of climate-related policies still remains to be seen, but definitely what has to be taken into consideration is that the geopolitics of raw materials are to change, and while hydrocarbons would most likely remain at the center of the geopolitics, meaning who owns the resources and who supplies them to areas where they are mostly used, some stress would be moved to the resources that are needed for new economies, for rare earth materials, and so on. So I welcome your questions, clarifications, and generally your comments and additions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Irina, for this interesting lecture. I'm Sophia Records. I'm a professor of UNICOM, so St. Petersburg State University of Economics. I didn't want to take the floor. I thought about students, but anyway. So I've got actually two questions to you. The first is maybe more fundamental. we speak about this unique situation when everything is changing. The market, we have quite a lot of uncertainties, and you mentioned some of them. Starting from the gas market, so we are facing with warm winter in Europe, coronavirus in China, and some depression. And anyway, China will diversify gas supply, and anyway, so this is actually the targets, the strategy of China. Then we are facing with this, thank you for this term, commoditization, meaning that the market is very complicated. It is double, so it has two patterns simultaneously. So, if to take Porter's theory, we are facing with this bargaining power of supply. So anyway, the consumer decides, actually, mostly. Yes. So everything goes simultaneously. So my question is about opportunities for Russian energy companies. Whether it is the situation of, so to say, ceteris paribus, so this just usual situation, as usual, business as usual, or you see some opportunities to change the strategy, to find a new niche, because we are facing at the same time with that, we have this Nord Stream 2, which is now more or less stopped. We are facing with the Turkish stream you mentioned, which was launched, but at the same time we have a TANAP, so we have this, not we, but Turkey has a TANAP, Trans-Anatolian pipeline from Azerbaijan to Turkey. So we have quite a lot of things at the same time. So whether Russian energy companies are thinking about some diversification or maybe some changing strategies, or this is okay for them, and they will continue to develop, to diversify between East and West, for example. And one more very short question, sorry for me to be so long, to take so much time. Another question is that, as far as we know, Russian energy companies are exporting or planning to export to Europe either pipeline gas and LNG. Whether they will compete, whether these companies will compete on this market by these two types of gas, of natural gas. So that's our main concerns, actually. So it's my frank question to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your questions. So the first question is whether companies continue business as usual or they try to adjust. And the second question is whether there is or will be competition in the European market between pipeline and LNG. I will start with the second question. I think President Putin said that there should be no competition between pipeline gas and LNG. I think that the business models for Gazprom and Novatek are different because Gazprom has contracts with companies in Europe and it has to supply to Europe, while Novatek has contracts for offtake from the plant. And basically, it is those off-takers who take LNG from the plant who, in the end, decide where it will end up. So, generally speaking, Novatek cannot, to the full-scale control where this LNG is going. So what we can see from the data of 2019 is that, in fact, majority of natural gas from Yamal LNG has actually ended up in the European market, as much more than 80% of all of the production. The production does not really measure up what is produced in Yamal LNG with the pipeline exports of Gazprom, but nevertheless, this is a matter of fact. Another issue is that there are some markets which only can import pipeline gas, like Austria and other landlocked countries, and other countries have opportunity to get both LNG and pipelines. And some countries like Spain or Portugal, they can only receive LNG and not the pipeline gas. So, I mean, direct competition, if you say so, takes place in the, potentially could take place in the countries who have both access to pipeline and LNG. and secondly, which are not fully contracted, which have not fully contracted their consumption. From the market point of view and the pricing point of view, I think it has been in various reports that in Yamal deliveries there is a higher degree of oil indexation than what is today the structure of pricing in Gazprom's contracts, which leads to more favorable conditions for the end buyer. So, answering your question frankly, I would say it is possible, even though there is generally an understanding that there should not be such competition. And there is a rationale behind it, because there is export duty for pipeline exports, and there is no export duty for Yamal LNG production. So if to the country which can import pipeline gas we supply LNG, then the budget does not receive the export duty. So from the state point of view, obviously, it would be more beneficial to pursue the pipeline. So I cannot give like a yes or no question, but I hope this explanation could probably clarify the picture. Whether companies are adjusting to the new realities, it is my understanding that in the energy sector, we see more or less, it upsets me to say, but I think we see business as usual a lot more. I think there are large announcements now being made, but I'm not yet convinced that they lead to the fundamental changes in the policies. So in the news, I recently saw that Rosneft has announced big climate-related targets, but that was just a recent announcement. In the Investor Day, Gazprom has included several statements on climate-related performance, on targets on improving efficiency and limiting the carbon intensity of production. So there are some figures, but they are probably not as fundamental as they have to be for a fully pronounced climate-related input. So I think it is more of business as usual. One notable example probably would be Rosatom. And there is a big discussion whether nuclear energy should be part of low emission solution, because when you have a nuclear power plant, you do not have CO2 emissions, but you have other risks of ecological nature. So some of the countries decide to phase out nuclear, while other countries decide that nuclear will help them to limit emissions. But Rosatom, I think, is doing some activities in renewable energy, and but generally speaking, for energy sector and for hydrocarbon sector, it looks to me that it's business as usual.
Other questions?
We'll finish, we'll continue with informal discussion.
Okay. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for visiting, for listening, and hope you will enjoy our informal discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you.